Welcome to day 3 of our 5-day challenge, and congratulations if you're here. You're already halfway through. So today we're going to be looking at something that students always want to know more about. It's how to improve their memory and recall. So before we look at that, we should think about why we forget things in the first place. So if you think back to the last time that you revised for a test or exam, if you reread your notes, that's trying to get information into your head. And by rereading your notes, it can really start to feel familiar and you feel like you're getting there. You might also have used maybe flashcards. But people who use flashcards and are very quick to turn them over and check, they perhaps didn't spend enough time really trying to make sure that they could get the information out of their head. So it might be a question of simply not testing yourself properly. Also, the easier it is to learn something, the more likely you are to forget it. And we tend to prefer doing easy activities than hard ones. Another point to think about is how long you left it between learning the information and going back to it. So let's have a look at a very simple model of how our memory works. Obviously, it's very complicated in reality. This is just a simplification. So we have loads of information and sensory input that we're constantly being bombarded with. We have sights, smells, sounds, feelings, tastes, sensations, and most of that is actually ignored and filtered out because we only really see what we pay attention to. And then in a class, assuming that we're paying attention to what we're learning, we will also usually have to rehearse our information. We're going to have to use our working memory to process it in some way. We might be making notes, and very likely we'll be answering questions in class, whether that be verbally or written down. And so as we're doing that, as we're rehearsing the information that we paid attention to, that information makes it more likely to go into our long-term memories. And this is where many students fall down, because particularly if they found the questions quite straightforward and they found the information easy to process, they might then think about it having gone into long-term storage like the hard drive on a computer. But our brains aren't like that. Just because it's gone into long-term storage doesn't mean that it stays there. Our brains reorganize themselves all the time. So even if we understood something in class and got all the questions right, it will soon be gotten rid of if we don't keep going back to retrieve it. And that is where retrieval practice is so important. And in fact, the two keys to our memory success are going to be retrieval practice and spaced learning. We will look a tiny bit at spaced learning, but it's not our focus for today. Our focus is going to be retrieval practice. We can't go through everything over the space of a short 5-day course. And in fact, you probably already know about the theory of the forgetting curve. So the blue line representing the amount of information, how well we understand our information or how much we retain, and how it goes down over time. And then the coloured lines above it are showing how if we top up our information regularly, we can stop and slow down the process of that memory retention decreasing. So spaced learning means simply that we revisit information frequently to keep it in our long-term memory. In fact, this graph isn't quite accurate because we would probably go over it after 1 week and then maybe leave 2 weeks before we go over the same topic again, and then leave a month before we go over the same topic again. And this forgetting curve is particularly true for teenagers because the adolescent brain is constantly reorganizing itself a lot more than for adults or younger children. So if you find you're forgetting things more often than you used to do and things are harder to recall, it's completely normal. So we're really going to focus more now today on retrieval practice. And this is just any attempt to get information back out of your brain, not to put it in your brain. You already did that in class. You're trying to get it back out in a sensible way. You may have heard it also called just recall, self-testing, or quizzing. Sometimes it's called low-stakes testing. So we're calling it that because we're making sure that you understand it's different to exam practice. And lots of students jump straight from making or reading their notes into the exam practice. But that's an entirely different skill, and we're going to look at that skill tomorrow. If you can't successfully retrieve the information you need, you won't be able to apply it to exam questions. So it is a separate thing that you should devote separate time in your studies to practice. And remember, this is something we looked at yesterday with the note making and is a recurring theme, I'm afraid. The easier a revision technique feels, the less useful it's likely to be. We don't want to completely feel stressed out or anxious when we're studying, but if we're just cruising through and getting everything right and remember everything perfectly, there's not really much point to what you're doing. And what you're probably doing is putting off the more difficult tasks that you should be doing instead. So we're going to look at just 5 different areas of retrieval practice, all very similar in the way that they work. First one is just a brain dump. This is really great. You can do this anywhere, anytime. If you just have a small amount of time, you just need a piece of paper or an app for making notes. You could just open a textbook, pick a topic at random, or if you have numbers on your chapters, you could use a random number generator. Just to pick something at random and just get a piece of paper, write down what you know. That's it. You can put a time limit on it so it doesn't feel quite so stressful. Maybe how much can you write about a particular topic in 10 minutes. So that's a brain dump. Really related to that, very, very similar, but is slightly better if you're a little bit scared of starting with a brain dump, is black pen, red pen. So start off with a black pen and draw a mind map or just make notes on a piece of paper, everything that you can remember about a particular topic. And then when you're finished, go back to your notes, take a red pen and add anything you've missed or make corrections. And again, it's really helpful if you do this in the same way that we did note making yesterday, where you don't do it straight from looking at your notes, but give yourself time to process and then make the corrections. And then we might want to focus specifically on keywords and definitions. So lots of people use flashcards to learn keywords and definitions, and that is really good at the start. Flashcards are really helpful, but they are easier because if you have a word in front of you, it's easier to remember the definition and vice versa. It's much harder to simply start and try and recall all the keywords from a topic off the top of your head. But that's the kind of thing that you might have to do if you were answering a long exam question. So to do this, try and write down a list of keywords for a topic. See if you can define those keywords, and then see if you can link them together into sentences or explanations. The more that you can link them, the more they will stay in the same part of your memory and get recalled as one piece of information as opposed to 20 different key terms. Finally, there's definitely a place for flashcards and quizzes, and there are some really great online platforms now that offer you loads of retrieval practice activities like Quizlet and Bitesize. Don't keep going over the same definitions if you always get them wrong. So the keeping records part, making notes might seem a bit tricky. If you're using flashcards, try separating them into piles, like this is the pile that I always get right, this is the pile that I sometimes get right, and then this is the pile that I always get wrong. Then you can focus more on the ones that you keep getting wrong. And apps like Quizlet will sort of automatically do that for you. When you've gone through a set of flashcards, try doing a brain dump of everything that you just went through. See how much harder it is to actually just try and recall it without the flashcard prompt. Of course, that's because it's harder, it's making your brain work harder. And don't just use flashcards for one topic at a time. As you go through the course, start to mix them up and shuffle in some flashcards from previous topics so that you don't just get comfortable remembering things that are all linked together. And for multiple choice quizzes, you can really make things more difficult. See if you can answer without having the options in front of you. You can't do this for every multiple choice question. Sometimes you have to know what the potential answers are, but for others, you might be able to work out what the answer is and maybe even what the alternative options are. If you're really struggling with a topic, then use flashcards first to build up confidence, or use the notes that you've made to just help reinforce your memory. But then, a few days later, test yourself more strictly using a brain dump or some other activity where you really have to recall everything from a blank slate. So today's challenge is kind of obvious. Remember that the point of yesterday's notes were that you could quickly flip them over and see if you could remember everything. And by seeing if you can remember everything, we want to actually try and write it down or say it out loud. Don't skip over the details and feel like because you turned it over and it seemed familiar that you definitely remembered it. These notes are also really, really good for a black pen, red pen exercise because they're easy to check whether you got everything right. But we don't just want to spend today using the notes that you did yesterday because yesterday's notes will be fresh in your mind. So you should spend at least half your time today retrieving something you haven't revised recently. This is going to feel really uncomfortable. You might get a tendency to get a little bit stressed because it can really feel awful if you go back to something and you feel like you can't remember anything at all. So just be patient with yourself. It's really, really normal to feel like you can't remember anything at the start. But the very practice of trying to remember is going to strengthen your synapses and kind of tell your brain that this information is important. So think of it just like basketball practice. If you were shooting hoops and you don't get it in the net every time, that doesn't mean that every time you miss, that was wasted practice. Because on average, you're going to get better at getting it in the net. So good luck, don't get stressed. Doesn't matter if you don't remember everything, the very fact that you're testing your brain and making it difficult is what is going to make all the difference in your studying.